Hello viewers, thank you for joining me, and welcome to the second part of my monster review, episode 40 to the end. It was quite a journey, in part because the technological issues I'd been having over the past few months finally caught up to me, and this will be the first review posted from my new laptop, but also because the story just really took off in the second half of the series. The kind of story where you try to talk about it after you're done and can't even figure out where to start. I'm generally pretty good about not spoiling specifics about the very end, but you can definitely expect some big reveals about the things leading up to it. Episode 39 left off in the aftermath of the Munich fire. Nina and Tenma had both failed to shoot Johann, and, separately, decided to travel to the Czech Republic to get a better understanding of where the twins' story began. There's very little to be found in regards to their mother, so the focus actually shifts to trying to find the author of that children's book that had triggered flashbacks in both the twins. They come to find out he was a pretty shady figure, involved in the orphanage experiments and going by at least 5 different pen names. The one that stuck with me was Franz Bonaparte, so that's what we'll be calling him here, even though they do reveal near the end that one of the other aliases was his real name. I have to say, the second half of the series did a much better job with that whole road trip aspect of the story that I hadn't loved about the first half. The pacing is a bit slow all the way through, but everything in the second half feels important. Some of the side stories in part 1 really felt unnecessary, which wasn't great for the experience when I was already impatient to get to the bigger story. These last 35 episodes actually spent a lot of time following characters other than Tenma or Nina, but they all end up being important to the main story in the end. A particular favorite of mine was Grimmer, who first helps Tenma sneak over the border. He introduces himself as a freelance journalist, researching human rights violations that were conveniently hidden from the public in the turmoil following the two halves of Germany coming back together. He has a particular interest in old school records and orphanages, looking for evidence of brainwashing. What we come to find out is that Grimmer is also a graduate of Kinderheim 511, the orphanage Johann was sent to, though he got out long before the revolt that destroyed the place. It was the kind of reveal I didn't know I needed until I got it. Grimmer's story is the one that shows you what the orphanages were really meant for when everything didn't go horribly wrong. While he was there, he underwent conditioning to erase all his emotions and his sense of self. Wolfgang Grimmer wasn't really his name, just one that had been assigned to him during the next step, when they sent him off to spy school, which he also graduated from. And as part of his cover, he got married and started a family, but that all fell apart when his son died unexpectedly. Unable to show any genuine emotion even at his own child's funeral, his wife left him, and Grimmer slipped away from his life as a spy. Now he travels around investigating the orphanage experiments, trying to uncover what really made him this way, and eventually leading him back to Franz Bonaparte as well. Grimmer's just one of those characters who's such a good person, while thinking that he's just manipulating everyone around him. Because he may still be faking the emotions, but the kindness is real. And he has a particular soft spot for children. He's a hard character not to like. It feels really fitting, actually, that the story expands to follow so many other characters. Because by the time you get to the end, it's clear that this story is so much bigger than Tenma, Nina, and Johann, and I definitely didn't understand that during the first half of the series. The way I viewed everything really changed by the final episode. All our characters' research keeps circling back around to 2 places: a little apartment over an old closed-down tavern, and a big abandoned building called the Red Rose Mansion, once a prominent meeting place for the Czech secret police, who were basically looking to overthrow the government. But just when they start to feel like they're making progress, Johann sets the mansion on fire, and the ensuing investigation uncovers more than 40 bodies buried under the roses. On the other side of things, Nina's remembered the apartment as the place she grew up before she and her brother escaped over the German border. She also has fuzzier memories of Johann being taken away one day. When he escaped from the mansion, they set the apartment on fire and used that distraction to get away. Except, she recognizes that there's something strange about those memories. As the viewer, we get to see firsthand what that something is long before she figures out for herself that everything she's seeing is coming from the wrong angles, not to mention the things she shouldn't have memories of at all. The twins were caught up in an experiment long before they were even born, with Bonaparte at the heart of it all. His organization was taking a leaf out of Hitler's book in their attempt to take over, trying to create superior human beings by matching up approved couples. The twins' mother, aside from meeting their ideal standards of beauty, was also an accomplished scientist with a degree in genetic engineering. She was paired up with a soldier, but the two fell in love for real. They decided to ditch the experiment when she got pregnant, but they were caught. The twins' father was killed, and Bonaparte imprisoned their mother until the twins could be born. Unfortunately for her, he then deemed them as the perfect specimens, and they were all kept under surveillance even after Bonaparte let them go. Until the time came when he needed to show some proof of the program's success. Their mother was told to hand over one of the twins, but Nina was the one who was taken away that day. The thing is, Franz Bonaparte had fallen in love with their mother and no longer wanted to subject her children to their plans, so he poisoned the wine that was served at their big, celebratory meeting, effectively getting rid of all the major players in this experiment who knew about the twins. He set Nina free, abandoned the mansion, and tried to resurrect his plans elsewhere. But the damage was already done. Nina was traumatized by what she saw that day, and Johann was traumatized over being the one who was spared. So after she told him her story, she did her best to block it out, and he internalized it until he remembered it as his own experience. And he reaches his final breaking point when Nina confronts those falsified memories and forces him to acknowledge the truth. Johann's final plans come in two parts. He wants to commit what Nina calls the perfect suicide, killing not only himself, but also everyone who ever knew about him, so it'll be like he never existed at all. But he also wants Tenma, that one spark of hope and pure goodness in his life, to be the last remaining survivor, figuring that once Tenma's as isolated and untethered as Johann himself was, he'll finally be forced to lose that hope, and acknowledge that no one's actually worth saving. And damn if this show didn't manage to prove me wrong after all. I said near the end of my review for the first half that I didn't think there was anything the series could possibly reveal that would redeem Johann for me, because a lot of the time he seemed almost mindlessly violent, right? A lot of the deaths didn't seem to serve any purpose, and no matter how messed up a childhood, at some point, he started making his own decisions to keep hurting people. But we see him continue to take on more and more of his sister's identity throughout Part 2. He even said flat out, pretty early on, that he was basically a ghost. He didn't really exist. To be so broken as to completely lose your sense of self and have to cling to someone else's identity to even feel real. Apparently those are the parameters you need to fulfill to get me to forgive just about anything. The series won the second I realized Johann wasn't motivated by hatred or a desire for revenge, but by guilt. And that was the start of what I felt was true enlightenment about this anime. Because once you acknowledge that Johann isn't really the monster, the logical next step is to try and determine who is, and they sure make it sound like it's going to be Franz Bonaparte, but then you finally meet him and he's just a sad old man, overcome with regrets about what he's done, trying to do some good with his life, but prepared to finally be held accountable whenever the past does catch up with him. By the end, Monster makes an effort to redeem everyone. And two things about that really impressed me. One was that it wasn't really obvious it was going to happen, and the other was that it worked. There was no one I felt I still couldn't forgive after this series was done with them, and with no one was that fact more striking than with Roberto. For most of the series, he felt more like the real monster. He was the number one henchman, doing the worst of the dirty work while Johann remained out of sight, and Roberto was everywhere, charming information out of the ex-fiancée, and then trying to kill her. When Tenma does get caught but manages to find a lawyer who actually believes in him, Roberto arrives as the lawyer's partner. Tenma shoots him in the library, and I was positive that was the end of him, but like some kind of phantom, he shows up again in part 2. And he says the bullet stole all the strength from one of his arms, but it doesn't make him any less dangerous. But then they reveal near the end that Roberto grew up with Grimmer, conditioned into being an emotionless machine, except people can't live like that indefinitely, and he never got out. So while Grimmer tried to find meaning in trusting in the good of humanity again, Roberto bought into this ideology that Johann was some sort of chosen one, and if he just followed his plans, his life would have some sort of meaning to it by the end. I mentioned that Grimmer was really easy to like, and Roberto was the opposite of that, but I couldn't be sympathetic to one but not the other. They just made it clear that Grimmer was the exception to his circumstances, not the rule. It was perfectly understandable how Roberto had ended up where he did once that backstory was revealed. At almost no point until that end does Monster seem like it's going to be a show with this sort of optimism at its core. There are sparks of hope throughout, but the darkness is always so present. I was preparing for a depressing conclusion full of necessary evils, because surely some of these things couldn't be forgiven, right? But by the time I reached episode 74, this anime was telling me a different kind of story. That sometimes people do evil things, but there was no one monster responsible for it all, and I believed it. This was the kind of show that I thought I had figured out, right up until I reached the end, and then those last few episodes changed everything. There are a few rough spots, looking back, and they mostly just have to do with my personal tastes in fiction. It was a little slow for me, all the way through, but the amount of time we spent with all these characters did ensure that it made an impact when those characters were brought back into the story, sometimes much later down the line. I tend to prefer more fantasy and magic-based settings, but I also love psychological stories, so it kept my interest on that front. The only shortcoming that I can't really get over is that they're really vague about where Johann ends up. The last episode is an epilogue that allows us to see everyone moving on with their lives. Johann is really the only exception, and for such an important character, I needed some sort of closure, even if the answer to that question was that he really was too broken to recover and would remain hospitalized for the rest of his life. Overall, though, I leave this series feeling like it was a really satisfying experience, and thank you again, Car1956, for recommending it to me. I really can't impress enough what a different experience it ended up being versus what I spent so long thinking it was going to be. It was a long journey, but I can't regret even the slower moments after reaching the end. Thank you for watching.